The dust of Tarkistan tasted of iron and finality. It clung to the back of Lieutenant Commander Marcus Thorne's throat, a gritty testament to the last 12 hours. From his position behind the shattered remnants of a market stall, he watched the sun bleed out across the serrated peaks of the Gorum Valley, painting the sky in hues of bruised purple and angry orange. It was a beautiful death for a day that had been anything but. His team Trident 7 was a ghost of itself. They had fast-roped into the village of Al-Qadra before dawn, a phantom force tasked with capturing or killing a high-value insurgent leader. The intelligence had been perfect, they were told. A surgical strike. But the intel was a lie. The village wasn't a sleepy haven. It was a baited trap, a hornet's nest kicked wide open. Now only 5 of the original 8 members of his team were still capable of fighting. 2 were dead. One, a young corpsman named Reyes, was bleeding out slowly, his breaths shallow and ragged against Thorne's side. Anything. Ghost Thorne's voice was a low rasp into his comms, the words scraping past the dryness in his mouth. From a collapsed minaret 50 yards away came the clipped reply of his sniper, Elias Ghost Vance. "Negative, sir. They're dug in on the ridge. At least 30, maybe more. They own the high ground. They own the exit. They're just waiting. Waiting for full dark. Waiting for the SEALs' ammunition to run dry. Waiting for their resolve to crumble." Thorne didn't blame them. It was good tactics. He would have done the same. He risked a glance over the splintered wood. The enemy fighters were shadows moving with a patient confidence that chilled him more than the descending mountain cold. They were disciplined. This wasn't some ragtag militia. He checked his rifle's magazine. 3 rounds left. He had scavenged 2 more from Miller, one of the fallen. 5 rounds to hold off an army. It was a grim joke. Hope, he realized with a clarity that was both terrifying and strangely calming, had bled out faster than the sun. It had seeped into the thirsty ground with the blood of his men. The SEALs, the legendary tip of the spear, the men who never quit, were broken. Not in spirit, not yet, but in circumstance. The math of their situation was simple, brutal, and absolute. Sir Reyes whispered, his eyes glassy. "Tell my wife." Quiet Sailor Thorne cut him off, his voice softer than he intended. He adjusted the tourniquet on Reyes's leg, a futile gesture. "Nobody's telling anyone anything. We get out of this. That's an order." Reyes managed a weak, bloody smile. He knew. They all knew. The bravado was a flimsy shield against the inevitable. Thorne looked at the faces of his remaining men, Vance stoic and unreadable behind his scope. Axe Novak, the breacher, his massive frame slumped in exhaustion. And Rico Diaz, the comms specialist, who kept desperately, hopelessly trying to raise a signal from their satellite radio. The radio was a brick, its antenna shattered in the initial firefight. Their lifeline to the world, to air support, to extraction, was gone. "Still nothing," Boss Rico said, his voice cracking with the admission of failure. Total blackout. They must have a jammer active. Of course they did. This was a well-planned execution. Thorne leaned his head back against the wall, the rough mud brick pressing into his skull. He closed his eyes. In the roaring silence between bursts of enemy fire, he allowed himself a single moment of despair. He thought of his daughter's face, her laughter, as he'd lifted her onto his shoulders just 3 weeks ago. It felt like a lifetime. He had always made it home. It was the one promise he had always kept. The enemy began to move, their shadowy forms creeping down the slope as the last light faded. They were coming to finish the job. Thorne raised his rifle, the weight of it familiar but no longer comforting. He chambered around. The sound was deafeningly final. 5 rounds. 5 chances to die fighting. He keyed his comm for what he knew would be the last time a message for his men alone. Trident 7 on me. Make every shot count. For Miller. For Jonesy. See you in Valhalla. A chorus of quiet, grim acknowledgments came back. The air grew still. The world narrowed to this dusty, forgotten corner of hell. The first insurgent fighter broke cover, sprinting toward their position. Thorn centered the man in his sights. His finger tightened on the trigger. This was it. The end of the line. And then a new sound cut through the air. It wasn't the crack of a rifle or the thump of a mortar. It was a low, guttural hum that grew steadily into a ferocious, air-tearing roar. It was a sound that didn't belong in this valley of death. It was the sound of something powerful, something angry coming from a place they no longer believed existed, the sky. Every man, SEAL and insurgent alike, froze and looked up. For a moment, there was nothing but the impossible noise. Then, cresting the ridge that had been their prison wall, a silhouette appeared against the dying light, a dark, ungraceful shape with straight wings and two massive engines mounted high on its fuselage. It was ugly, brutal, and the most beautiful thing Marcus Thorne had ever seen. It was an A-10, a Warthog, and it was diving. 700 miles away and 40,000 feet closer to the stars. Captain Katarina Rostova felt nothing of the desperation bleeding into the Turkestan soil. Her world was a pressurized cocoon of glass and steel, a self-contained universe humming with the steady, reassuring drone of two General Electric TF-34 turbofan engines. The cockpit of her A-10 Thunderbolt II call sign, Valkyrie 2-1, smelled faintly of ozone-worn leather and lukewarm coffee from the thermos wedged beside her ejection seat. It was the scent of her office, an office that happened to move at 500 miles per hour. This was her third and final patrol of the day, a routine show-of-force flight along the established safe corridor. Below her, the vast, empty expanse of the central desert unspooled like a bolt of sepia-toned fabric. It was a mission designed for maximum boredom: fly a predictable box pattern, let the locals see an American jet, and return to Bagram. It was a politician's mission, not a pilot's. After 6 months in country, Kat could fly it with her eyes closed. The monotony was its own form of danger, a siren song that lured complacency. She shifted in her seat, the G-suit constricting around her legs. Her eyes, a pale, clear blue that seemed to hold the cold of the upper atmosphere, scanned the instrument panel. Fuel good. Systems green across the board. The world outside her canopy was a masterpiece of serene indifference. Above, the cosmos was beginning to punch through the thinning veil of twilight. Below, the earth was a formless shadow. She was the solitary guardian at the edge of the world, a watcher in the void. And she was tired. A deep, bone-weary fatigue that had little to do with lack of sleep and everything to do with the grinding, repetitive nature of a war that had forgotten why it started. It was then that the ghosts began to speak. It started as a faint crackle on the guard frequency, the universal emergency channel that was almost always silent. A burst of static, nothing more. Kat almost dismissed it as atmospheric interference, a common occurrence over the mineral-rich mountains. But then it came again, clearer this time, a voice stretched thin by distance and desperation. Repeat any friendly call sign on this net. This is Trident 7. Overrun. Request immediate. The transmission dissolved into a high-pitched squeal. Kat's posture straightened instantly. The weariness evaporated, replaced by the sharp, cold focus that had kept her alive for over 1,000 combat hours. Trident 7. Navy SEALs. They shouldn't have been operating this far east, not according to her briefing. Her fingers danced across the comms panel, adjusting the squelch, trying to clean the signal. A pin down at grid. 34S. WH. 772. 930. Multiple K. Need. The voice was American, strained with adrenaline and the metallic tang of fear. Another voice, younger, cut in. Ammo critical. They're closing. Then nothing but the hiss of empty air. Kat's blood ran cold. She knew that tone of voice. It was the sound of men who were already counting their lives in seconds. She cross-referenced the coordinates on her multifunction display. The numbers blinked back at her, a death sentence in digital green. The Gorum Valley. A network of treacherous intersecting canyons colloquially known as the Man-Pad's Maze. It was a red zone on every pilot's map, a no-fly area unless under the most extreme circumstances, and with a full CAD suppression of enemy air defenses package. She was alone. Bagram Command. This is Valkyrie 2-1, she said, her voice a model of professional calm, betraying none of the turmoil in her chest. Be advised, I have picked up a fragmented, unconfirmed distress call. Possible U.S. ground element in contact, grid reference follows. She read the coordinates, her mind already working through a dozen variables. Fuel consumption rates, ordnance load, threat assessments. The response from command was swift and predictable. Valkyrie 2-1, copy that. Stand by. A moment later, a new voice patched through. Colonel Alistair Finch, the Air Wing commander. His tone was clipped, devoid of warmth. Valkyrie, that grid is deep in hostile territory. We have no assets in that sector. The transmission is likely enemy deception. Maintain your patrol route. Do you copy? Sir, the call sign was Trident 7. The voice sounded authentic, Kat countered, keeping her tone respectful but firm. Captain Finch's voice was sharp now, an undisguised order. Your job isn't to authenticate voices, it's to fly your profile. The Gorum Valley is a death trap. You are to return to base on schedule. Acknowledge. Acknowledged, she said the word, tasting like ash. Return to base. The same order she had followed 2 years ago in Helmand. A Marine recon team had been ambushed calling for fire support, but a sandstorm was rolling, invisibility was dropping, and the rules of engagement were strict. Command had ordered her to disengage. She had obeyed. She had listened to their final desperate pleas for help as she turned her jet and flew away. She later learned they were all killed, overwhelmed, less than 10 minutes after she left station. She remembered the name of their corporal, a young man named Harris, whose voice she could still hear in her dreams. The static hissed again, and one final broken phrase tore through the silence. Caged in. They're on the... Caged in. The exact words Corporal Harris had used. The cockpit suddenly felt smaller, the air thinner. It was happening again. A different valley, a different team, but the same ghosts were calling her name. Kat looked from her flight path indicator, a neat green line leading back to safety, to the ominous red polygon on her map that marked the Gorum Valley. Colonel Finch's order was echoing in her headset, but the voice of Corporal Harris was echoing in her soul. Chakchanroa. Due Jaila Chapter 3 Bamsat Theodan Iban Jan Kung Kap. The silence that followed Colonel Finch's order was heavier than the thinning atmosphere outside the canopy. It was a silence filled with unspoken history, with the weight of regulations written in the blood of pilots who had taken risks and lost. Kat's fingers encased in their slim flight gloves rested on the throttle. The logical, disciplined part of her mind, the part that had earned her the call sign Valkyrie and the command of a machine like the A-10, acknowledged the order. It was a sound order, a defensible one. The Gorum Valley was not just a location. It was a cautionary tale told to new pilots at Bagram. Its steep canyon walls created unpredictable wind shears and masked radar signals, while its ridges provided perfect concealment for insurgents armed with shoulder-fired surface-to-air missiles. Sending a lone A-10 into that environment was not a calculated risk. It was a suicide run. Finch was protecting his asset. He was protecting her. But the desperate voices on the radio were not assets. They were men. And the protocol that was meant to save her life felt like it was sentencing them to death. "Command Valkyrie." Kat transmitted her voice steady, forcing the emotion out of it. "Respectfully, sir, the transmission was too clear to be a deception. The terminology, the cadence, it was American S-off. If there is even a small chance they are pinned down, a flyby could be enough to break contact and allow for extraction." She was negotiating, trying to find a loophole in the wall of his command. She wasn't asking to go in guns blazing just to look. A reconnaissance pass. A professional courtesy from one warrior to another. The response was immediate. Finch's voice now laced with an icy impatience. "Captain, I have the same intelligence you do. And I have something you don't, a direct feed from a Reaper drone that was over the adjacent sector 30 minutes ago. It detected multiple active anti-air signatures in the Gorum Valley. This is exactly the kind of trap they set. They dangle a juicy target lure in air support and add a multi-million-dollar jet and its pilot to their kill count for the day. We are not taking that bait." His logic was a steel cage, each bar a perfectly reasonable point. He was painting a picture of a tactical reality that she could not and should not ignore. He was the commander seeing the entire chessboard, while she was just a single piece consumed with one small section of the fight. "Sir, Trident 7 is a Tier 1 asset." Kat pushed her knuckles white as she gripped the control stick. Their loss would be a strategic failure. Isn't that worth the risk of a single airframe? It was a bold, almost insubordinate question. She was questioning his strategic judgment. There was a pause on the other end. When Finch spoke again, his voice had lost its anger and was replaced by a deep, weary authority. It was the voice of a man who had attended too many memorial services. "Every pilot I have is a Tier 1 asset, Captain Rostova. Every life is a strategic consideration. I will not trade your life on a small chance. I will not send your mother a folded flag because you decided to follow a ghost on the radio. Your orders have not changed. You will adjust your course to heading 095 and return to Bagram immediately. That is not a suggestion. It is a direct and lawful order. Confirm you have received and understood." The finality in his tone was absolute. He had invoked her name, stripping away the anonymity of her call sign. He had made it personal. He had built the wall of protocol brick by brick, and now he was standing firmly behind it. Any further argument would be outright defiance. "Understood, command." Kat said the words, feeling foreign and wrong in her mouth. "Valkyrie 2-1 is turning to heading 095, returning to base." She banked the A-10, the powerful engines responding smoothly to her touch. The nose of the Warthog swung eastward away from the Gorum Valley, away from the silenced voices. On her navigation display, the green line of her flight path pointed toward the safety of the airfield, toward a hot meal and a clean bunk. Every instinct for self-preservation, every ounce of her training, told her she was doing the right thing. But in her mind's eye, she saw the face of Corporal Harris. She saw the wreckage of his team's Humvee, a photograph in a debriefing file she had looked at 100 times. She had followed orders that day, and 6 Marines had died. She had been cleared of all wrongdoing. A board of inquiry had called her actions a model of air discipline and adherence to the rules of engagement. They had given her a medal for it, and she had never hated anything more in her life. The A-10 flew on a perfect machine, following a perfect flight path. But inside the cockpit, its pilot was locked in a gut-wrenching, silent conflict. The orders of her commander warred with the echoes of the dead. The logic of survival battled the instinct to protect. Colonel Finch had given her an order to save her life, but as the distance to the Gorum Valley increased with every passing second, Katarina Rostova felt with chilling certainty that if she obeyed it, she would lose a part of herself that she could never get back. The A-10 flew east, a paragon of obedience. On the heads-up display, the green vector line pointed a clear, unwavering path home. The machine did as it was told, but the pilot was no machine. Inside Katarina Rostova's mind, a storm was gathering, one far more violent than any she could see outside her canopy. Colonel Finch's words about a folded flag were meant to be a sobering anchor to reality, but instead, they had dredged up a ghost. The low, rhythmic hum of the avionics cooling fans began to sound like the wind whipping across the Helmand Desert. The cool, sterile air of the cockpit started to feel thick with sand. The memory did not arrive like a lightning strike. It seeped in a rising tide of shame and regret that she had spent 2 years trying to hold back. Helmand Province 2 years ago. The sky was the color of mustard gas. A massive shamal, a seasonal sandstorm, was advancing like a solid wall across the plains. Kat had been flying her Warthog in tight circles, her visibility shrinking by the second. Below, a 4-man Marine reconnaissance team, call sign Pathfinder 4, was in a firefight, their light vehicle disabled. Valkyrie, this is Pathfinder 4. A young, steady voice had crackled in her ears. Corporal Jacob Harris. She had never seen his face, but she knew his voice intimately, had learned its every inflection over the previous 3 hours as she provided overwatch. Be advised, we are taking effective fire from a fortified position, bearing 2 to 70 from our location. Solid copy, Pathfinder, she'd replied, banking the A-10 hard. I have eyes on the structure, am commencing gun run west to east. Her first pass had been perfect. The GAU-8 Avenger had ripped the air apart, turning the mud brick compound into a cloud of dust and splinters. The enemy fire ceased. Good hit, Valkyrie. Good hit, Harris's voice was jubilant. You scattered them. We're going to try to get the vehicle moving. But the vehicle was dead, and the insurgents were not scattered. They had regrouped, reinforced. The firefight resumed with greater intensity, just as the leading edge of the sandstorm reached them. The world outside Kat's canopy dissolved into a swirling vortex of sand. Her instruments became her only eyes. Valkyrie, the storm is on top of us. Harris reported, his voice tighter now. They're using it for cover. They're closing in. Valkyrie. This is Skyhammer. Her commander's voice cut in from the command post. Weather is red. Ceiling and visibility are 0-0. You are ordered to disengage and return to base. Skyhammer. I can still provide support, Kat had argued, her heart pounding. I can use the targeting pod fly on instruments. Just one more pass. Negative, Valkyrie. The risk of spatial disorientation is too high. You are no good to them if you fly into a mountain. You follow my order. Return to base. Now. She had hesitated for 3 agonizing seconds, her plane bucking in the turbulence. She heard Harris again, his voice strained, the sound of his rifle firing in the background. Valkyrie, please advise. They're setting up a mortar. We're being caged in. Caged in. The same 2 words. The same death sentence. She had followed the order. With a sickness rising in her throat, she had pushed the throttle forward and climbed out of the storm, leaving Pathfinder 4 behind in the suffocating darkness. The last thing she heard from Corporal Harris wasn't a scream or a curse. It was a single bewildered word that had haunted every quiet moment of her life since. Valkyrie. It was a question. A question that asked, "You're leaving. You're really leaving us." Then only static. A roaring, empty static that was louder than any explosion. Now, flying over Turkestan, the same static seemed to hiss in her ears. The ghost of Jacob Harris was in the cockpit with her. He sat in the empty space behind her seat, his unseen eyes judging her. He was the reason she flew with such cold precision, the reason she studied threat maps until her eyes burned, the reason she never, ever bent the rules. Because she had followed them once, and it had cost good men their lives. Colonel Finch's logic was sound. He was protecting her. But what he didn't understand, what no one in a command center looking at a screen could ever understand, was that she was already dead in a way. A part of her had died with Pathfinder 4 in that storm. Obeying this order wouldn't save her. It would just kill her again. It would prove that she hadn't learned a thing. It would make her a coward not once by mistake, but twice by choice. The A-10 continued its eastward course. 1 minute passed, then 2. Her fuel counter ticked down. The window of opportunity to help Trident 7, if there ever was one, was closing. Katarina Rostova took a slow, deep breath. She looked at the green line on her display leading home. Then she looked at the red polygon marking the Gorum Valley. She thought of the men down there, their ammunition running low, their hope bleeding out into the dust. She thought of their voices, and she thought of Jacob Harris's final questioning plea. Not again, she thought. Never again. Her hands moved with a sudden, undeniable purpose. The practiced, fluid grace of a pilot who was one with her machine. She did not hesitate. With a firm, decisive motion, she gripped the control stick and banked the A-10 Thunderbolt II hard to the left, rolling the aircraft into a steep 90-degree turn. The nose of the Warthog swung away from the safety of the east and pointed like a vengeful spear directly at the heart of the Gorum Valley. The wall of protocol was behind her. Ahead, there was only the mission. The turn was an act of pure violence against the aircraft's momentum. The G-forces pressed Katarina deep into her seat, as the A-10, a machine designed for stability and brute force, protested the sudden aggressive maneuver. The world outside the canopy became a spinning blur of darkening sky and shadowed earth. For a few seconds, she was flying purely on instinct and the trust she had in her machine's rugged airframe. Then the wings leveled out. The violent shudder subsided into a determined hum. The nose of the Warthog was now pointed west, toward the fight. An irreversible line had been crossed. Every minute she flew in this direction, she was flying deeper into her own court-martial. The career she had painstakingly built was turning to ash in her wake. But a strange, cold calm settled over her. The turmoil of the past hour had vanished, burned away by the clarifying fire of purpose. The ghost of Corporal Harris was no longer an accuser, but a silent co-pilot, a solemn witness. She would not fail another team. Her focus narrowed, becoming as sharp as a laser. This was no longer about emotion. It was about execution. Her gloved fingers moved over the console with practiced efficiency, a surgeon preparing for a complex operation. First, she reached for the IFF panel. With a decisive flick of a switch, she put the transponder from norm to ST-BY. On the air traffic control screens back at Bagram, her friendly blue icon clearly labeled Valkyrie 2-1 would simply vanish. They might still see a faint primary radar return an unidentified blip, but her official electronic handshake with the friendly sky was gone. She was a ghost. Next, she managed her communications. She left the primary radio tuned to Finch's command frequency, a silent testament to the order she was breaking. But she turned the volume down to 0. Then she brought up the volume on her secondary radio tuned to the emergency guard channel where she had heard the SEALs. She would not transmit. Not yet. First, she had to listen. Finally, she built her alibi. The lie had to be plausible. Experienced severe avionics malfunction and intermittent comms failure consistent with electromagnetic interference from the Gorum mountain range. Was forced to deviate from flight plan to maintain control of aircraft. It was thin, but it was better than nothing. It was a story for the inevitable inquiry, a final futile attempt to shield herself. But she knew the truth would be written in the flight recorder's data. With her electronic signature erased and her story straight, she faced the true problem, physics and terrain. Colonel Finch was right. A direct flight over the main ridge was an engraved invitation for a missile. She needed a back door. Her eyes darted to her central display, to the detailed topographical map of the valley. It was a jagged scar on the earth, a maze of peaks and ravines. The SEALs were trapped in the wider basin-like area, the kill zone. The insurgents held the high ground on the northern and eastern ridges. Their positions perfectly situated to fire down on any aircraft making a conventional approach. But to the south, her map showed something else. A thin, serpentine crack in the rock, a dry riverbed that snaked its way through the mountain foothills before emptying into the valley floor less than 2 miles from the SEAL's last known position. On the map, it was labeled Tark-e-Anmar, which translated, she knew from her briefings, to the Serpent's spine. It was incredibly narrow with sheer cliffs rising hundreds of feet on either side. Most pilots would dismiss it as impassable, a topographical error. Kat saw it as an opportunity, a needle that needed to be threaded. Flying through the Serpent's spine would be the most dangerous and technically demanding flight of her life. The slightest miscalculation, a sudden gust of wind, and her wingtip would be sheared off against a cliff wall. But it offered one priceless advantage: concealment. The rock walls would mask her heat signature and her sound until the very last moment. She could bypass the watchers on the main ridges entirely and emerge from the canyon's mouth like a demon right on the enemy's flank. It was a pilot's gambit. All or nothing. The fear was there, a cold knot in her stomach. She acknowledged it, accepted it, and then locked it away. Fear had no place in this equation. There was only the machine, the mission, and the skill of the woman flying it. She eased the control stick forward, and the A-10 began a gradual descent from its cruising altitude, shedding height, as it raced towards the mountains. The setting sun glinted off the armored glass of her canopy. Below her, the entrance to the Serpent's spine grew from a thin line on a map into a dark, foreboding slash in the earth, a jagged wound in the rock waiting to swallow her whole. She took one last, steadying breath, the recycled air of the cockpit filling her lungs. Her gaze was fixed on the entry point. Her hands were steady on the controls. "You all right, Piggy?" She murmured to her plane, a rare moment of affection for the famously ugly jet that had brought her home so many times. "Let's go earn our pay." With that, she pushed the nose down and committed the Warthog to the abyss. The moment the A-10 crossed the threshold of the Serpent's spine, the world changed. The vast open sky vanished instantly, replaced by towering walls of granite that clawed upwards on either side of her canopy. The golden light of sunset was snuffed out, plunging the cockpit into a deep blue-gray twilight. The roar of the twin engines, once dissipated into the endless atmosphere, now became a deafening, echoing thunder, trapped and amplified between the narrow canyon walls. It felt as if the mountain itself was screaming. This was a realm not meant for a machine of this size. The A-10 Thunderbolt II was built to be a resilient, brutal instrument of war, a flying tank. In the open sky, it was a predator. Here, squeezed between tons of unmoving rock, it felt fragile, vulnerable, like a leviathan forced into a stream. The tips of her wings, which spanned over 57 feet, seemed to be only inches from the jagged, unforgiving stone. All the abstract fears of career suicide and insubordination were gone. All the haunting memories of the past were silenced. Katarina Rostova's entire consciousness contracted to a single razor-sharp point of focus. Her hands, which had been so tense moments before, were now light and fluid on the control stick, her inputs almost imperceptible. Her feet danced on the rudder pedals, a constant subtle ballet, to counteract the treacherous swirling winds that eddied and gusted through the ravine. Every instinct, every hour of training, every lesson learned from a decade of flying was now in play. Her mind became a hyper-efficient processor, absorbing a torrent of data and translating it into precise physical action. She wasn't just flying the plane, she was wearing it. The groans of the airframe under stress were the groans of her own bones. The vibrations through the stick were the beat of her own heart. The canyon twisted ahead of her, a labyrinth with no map. She couldn't see more than a few hundred yards at a time, forcing her to react with a speed that was more intuition than thought. A sudden downdraft tried to slam her towards the canyon floor. She fed power to the engines, the roar intensifying as she fought for every inch of altitude. A rock spire, unseen until the last second, jutted out from the left wall. She rolled the plane 45 degrees, her left wing slicing upwards into the narrow gap of open air, her right wing pointing down at the dry riverbed below before leveling out again in a seamless, heart-stopping maneuver. In this crucible of concentration, a strange and profound silence descended upon her. The roaring engines became a background hum, a constant in her new reality. The world outside the cockpit was a blur of gray rock and deep shadow, a monochrome tunnel. All that mattered was the next turn, the next gust of wind, the next sliver of sky. It was a state of pure, unadulterated focus, a place where past and future ceased to exist. There was only the now, this single eternal second of flight. And in that silence, she felt an acute, piercing solitude. She was a solitary trespasser in a hostile, ancient world. This canyon had stood here for millennia, carved by wind and water, indifferent to the brief, violent struggles of mankind. Her presence here felt like a sacrilege, a violation. The weight of her decision was no longer a moral burden, but a physical one. She was the only friendly soul for 100 miles. The lives of 5 men she had never met rested entirely on her ability to navigate this passage, on the steadiness of her hands, on the strength of her nerve. There was no one to call for help. There was no one to witness her failure. After what felt like an eternity, a lifetime spent in the belly of the mountain, she saw it. A change in the quality of the light ahead. The oppressive darkness of the ravine began to yield to the softer, bruised purple glow of the evening sky. The canyon walls began to recede. The end of the tunnel was near. She eased back gently on the throttle, preparing for the transition. The quiet intensity of the flight was about to end. The silence was about to be broken by the brutal language of her aircraft's purpose. She was no longer just a pilot threading a needle. In a few seconds, she would become the wrath she had been holding back, the Valkyrie, descending upon the field of battle. The Serpent's spine had been the price of admission. Now it was time to join the war. Death was a living thing in the ruins of Al-Qadra. It had a sound, the snap of bullets passing inches from Thorn's head, and a smell, the coppery tang of his men's blood mixing with the ancient dust. He had his rifle pressed to his shoulder, the metal cold against his cheek. Through his optic, He watched the lead insurgent fighter bound over a pile of rubble, his weapon raised. Thorn's world had shrunk to the size of this single man, this single final act of defiance. His finger squeezed the trigger, taking up the slack. There was no thought of survival. There was only the cold, hard calculus of the soldier to take as many of the enemy with him as he could. He was a SEAL. He would not die cowering. He would die fighting his empty rifle, a testament to his resolve. Beside him, Axe Novak let out a guttural yell, firing a 3-round burst from his own nearly empty magazine. One of the advancing shadows stumbled and fell. It was in this moment, a moment stretched thin between one breath and the next, that the universe changed its rules. A new sound entered the symphony of combat. It wasn't the familiar crack of an AK-47 or the sharp report of their own M4s. It was a low, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate up from the ground itself, a deep thrumming that Thorn felt in the fillings of his teeth. The insurgent in his sights hesitated, his head tilting in confusion. All across the small battlefield, the frantic movements of the attackers slowed as they tried to place the alien noise. The hum grew exponentially, swelling into a deep, guttural roar that tore through the air. It wasn't coming from over the ridge, the direction from which any conventional air support would have arrived. It was coming from the south, from the direction of the impassable canyonlands. It was the sound of a caged beast that had just broken its chains. "What the hell is that?" Rico Diaz yelled over the din, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and disbelief. Thorn didn't answer. He knew that sound. It was a sound seared into the memory of every ground soldier who had ever been in a desperate fight. It was the sound of salvation. He slowly lowered his rifle, his gaze turning southward with the rest of his team. And then it appeared. It didn't soar gracefully into view. It erupted. It burst from the mouth of a narrow, shadowed ravine like a cannonball fired from the depths of the earth. An A-10 Thunderbolt, too. It was flying impossibly low, its dark, rugged frame seeming to skim the tops of the ruined buildings. Its straight wings and high-mounted engines gave it the profile of a predator, something primal and built for one purpose. For a stunned second, no one moved. The entire village, SEALs and insurgents alike, was frozen in collective awe and terror. Hope is a dangerous thing on a battlefield. It can soften a resolve that has been hardened by despair. But what Thorn felt wasn't a gentle glimmer. It was a physical jolt, a surge of pure, savage adrenaline that chased the exhaustion from his limbs and the fog from his mind. He saw it reflected in the eyes of his men. Axe Novak's grimace of defiance was replaced by a wide, incredulous grin. Elias Vance, the stoic sniper, had lowered his rifle and was watching the jet with the reverence of a man witnessing a miracle. Even Reyes, the wounded corpsman, had propped himself up on one elbow, his pain-filled eyes fixed on the sky. This was impossible. Command had been clear, no air support available. The sector was too hot, the risks too high. No pilot would be sent on this suicide mission. Yet here it was. A Warthog. A guardian angel from a heaven they had stopped believing in. The A-10 didn't circle. It didn't wait for permission. It had come with intent. As it cleared the ravine, it banked hard, its wingtips seeming to scrape the minaret where Ghost was perched. The pilot, whoever they were, had a perfect, horrifying view of the tactical situation. They could see the SEALs' surrounded position. They could see the swarm of enemy fighters closing in for the kill. Thorn's hand instinctively went to the radio on his vest, his thumb pressing the transmit button out of sheer muscle memory. "Unknown aircraft. This is Trident 7, we are." He cut himself off. The radio was dead. They had no way to talk to this phantom, no way to guide its fire or warn it of their positions. But as the Warthog leveled its wings and the blunt, menacing nose of the aircraft began to align with the largest concentration of enemy fighters on the slope, Thorne realized something with a chilling clarity. The pilot didn't need their help. They had come through the Serpent's spine. They had used the one approach no one would ever expect. This wasn't a random patrol that had stumbled upon their fight. This pilot knew they were here. This pilot had come for them. The roaring of the engines was the promise. And as the plane steadied its course, every man on the ground held their breath, waiting for the thunder that they knew would follow. Chakshan Roy, Jaila Chapter 8. Muta jot tan kong jiao tien tu hei goxn hin huan tuan trai ngwokn hao. Suchin sak jen lan lung trong buong lai va su ku roi dieu ki duoi mat jat. From Katarina Rostova's perspective, the world below was a geometric problem waiting to be solved. The chaos of the battle, the desperation of the men on the ground, was filtered through the cold, green-tinted lens of her targeting pod display. The SEALs huddled behind their meager cover were a cluster of warm, friendly heat signatures that her mind automatically cordoned off with a mental no-fire zone. The enemy, however, bloomed across her screen in dozens of bright, hostile blossoms, a concentration of targets so perfect it was almost a textbook example. Her heart rate was a steady 65 beats per minute. Her breathing was a slow, controlled rhythm. This was her sanctuary, the place where emotion was a liability and precision was the only god. Her A-10, having climbed just enough to reacquire the target area, now rolled into a shallow 30-degree dive. The landscape tilted in her view, and the large group of insurgents preparing to rush the SEAL's position filled her heads-up display. The targeting reticle, a green circle, settled over the enemy fighters. Her thumb moved from its resting place and settled onto the top of the control stick, onto the grooved two-stage trigger. The first stage armed the weapon system. The second would unleash hell. A calm female voice, the jet's automated system, spoke a single emotionless word in her headset. Locked. She pressed the trigger to the first stage. A low hum resonated through the airframe. She made a final minute adjustment with her right rudder pedal, aligning the plane's nose perfectly. Then, with no fanfare, no final thought, she squeezed the trigger through the second stage. The GAU-8 Avenger cannon, a 7-barreled Gatling gun the size of a small car, spun to life. The first 30mm armor-piercing incendiary round left the barrel at over 3,000 feet per second. 0.03 of a second later, another followed, and another, and another. The entire aircraft was seized by a violent, bone-jarring shudder, as if it were being torn apart from the inside. The cockpit filled with the acrid smell of burnt propellant, a scent that always reminded Kat of lightning striking nearby. It was a controlled, contained earthquake, a physical manifestation of unimaginable power. For 3 surreal seconds, she was no longer a pilot flying a plane, but a rider on the back of a dragon guiding its fiery breath across the earth. She released the trigger, pulled back on the stick, and banked hard to the right, the G-forces pressing her into her seat as she climbed away to assess her work. Down on the ground, Marcus Thorne saw the Warthog dip its nose. Time seemed to slow to a crawl. He saw the cluster of enemy fighters rise as one, their confidence returning, ready to charge. They saw the plane, but they didn't yet understand what it was. They thought it was a scout, a high-flying jet that couldn't touch them in this maze of ruins. They were wrong. The sound came first. It was not the crack of a rifle or the boom of an explosion. It was a sound that defied description, a noise that bypassed the ears and punched directly into the sternum. It was the sound of the sky itself being ripped into shreds. What? It was a divine, terrifying roar, a furious outburst that lasted only a few seconds, but felt like an eternity. It was the sound of Armageddon. Thorn instinctively ducked his hands, coming up to cover his head as the sheer acoustic violence washed over them. It was the angriest sound he had ever heard. Close behind the sound came the visual proof of its power. The ground where the insurgents had been massing simply erupted. It didn't explode. It was erased. A line of red tracers looking like incandescent hornets stitched a perfect seam across the enemy position. The earth frothed and churned as hundreds of high-explosive rounds impacted in the space of a heartbeat, each one creating a miniature volcano of dust, rock, and fire. The men who had been standing there a moment before were gone, consumed by a storm of depleted uranium and raw kinetic energy. The shockwave. A blast of hot, gritty air slammed into the SEALs' position, rattling their teeth and stealing their breath. Then, as quickly as it had begun, it was over. An unnatural silence fell over the village, broken only by the fading roar of the A-10's engines as it climbed away, and the soft tinkling of spent shell casings that seemed to be raining from the sky. Thorn slowly raised his head. The air was thick with dust and the smell of cordite. Where a force of 30 men had been preparing to wipe them out there was now only a smoking, cratered ruin. The few surviving insurgents were scrambling in blind panic, their will to fight utterly shattered. He looked at his men. Their faces were masks of awe streaked with dirt and sweat. They were all looking up, following the dark shape of the A-10 as it wheeled gracefully against the purple sky, already lining up for another pass. This was not a dance of death. Not for them. For them it was a hymn of salvation sung by a 7-barreled choir from on high. It was the most beautiful and terrible music they had ever heard. For Katarina Rostova, the first gun run was a clinical success. On her display, the cluster of hostile heat signatures had been replaced by a single large fading thermal bloom. Battle damage assessment, catastrophic and effective. But the fight wasn't over. Several smaller pockets of resistance remained, including a pickup truck with a heavy machine gun mounted in its bed that was now spitting streams of tracer fire into the sky, a futile but defiant gesture. She leveled the A-10 at 8,000 feet, a hawk circling its prey, and began a wide banking turn to line up for her second pass. The movements were economical, practiced. Identify threat, acquire target, destroy, repeat. It was the rhythm of her trade, a violent but orderly process. The initial shock of the insurgents' panic below was a predictable part of this rhythm. She expected them to break and run. But from the perspective of the insurgent commander, a man named Tariq al-Jamil, panic was a luxury he could not afford. He had been thrown against a wall by the force of the blast, but he was alive, his ears ringing, his face caked with the dust of his vaporized comrades. He was a veteran of many wars, and he knew the psychology of the A-10. It was a terror weapon, but it was also predictable. It had to make passes. It had to expose itself. Man pads, he roared, his voice raw. Teams Gamma and Delta to the northern ridge. Now wait for my signal. His surviving men, shaken but disciplined, moved with purpose. The initial shock was already being replaced by a cold, vengeful fury. 2 teams of 2 men each scrambled from their concealed positions, each team carrying the green launch tube of a 9K-38 Igla, a Soviet-era shoulder-fired, heat-seeking missile. They were the reason this trap had been set. They were the fangs of the Serpent. They climbed to a pre-designated rocky outcrop that would give them a clear shot at the A-10 as it completed its next turn. In her cockpit, Kat was oblivious to this coordinated response. Her focus was on the technical. She rolled her Warthog back in the nose, dropping as she began her dive. The world tilted once more. The target grew larger in her HUD. Her thumb moved to the weapon selector, choosing a pair of Maverick missiles for this harder target. Her world was for that brief moment simple and clear. That simplicity was shattered by a sudden high-pitched shriek in her headset. It was the sound of her missile warning system MWS, an electronic scream that signaled a launch. Simultaneously, a bright red light flashed on her dash, and her RWR display showed a new immediate threat spike from her 6 o'clock low. The hunter had just become the prey. There was no time for thought, only for reaction forged from thousands of hours of training. Kat's body responded before her conscious mind could even process the fear. With a violent, reflexive motion, she slammed the throttles to their forward stops, engaging the engine's full combat power. Simultaneously, her left hand hammered the countermeasures button. Thump, 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 thump. From dispensers on the A-10's belly, a series of intensely hot magnesium flares ejected, igniting into brilliant, blinding white suns. They were designed to be a more attractive target for a heat-seeking missile than her engines. At the same time, she yanked the control stick hard to the left and down, throwing the A-10 into a gut-wrenching high-G brake turn, trying to put as much distance and angular change as possible between her plane and the missile's flight path. From the ground, Thorne and his men saw it all unfold with horrifying clarity. A puff of white smoke erupted from the ridge opposite them. A second later, a thin, perfect line of white vapor shot into the sky, streaking directly toward their guardian angel. "Missile, missile away!" Ghost screamed over the comms, a useless warning but an undeniable reflex. The men of Trident 7 could only watch their hearts seizing in their chests. Their miraculous salvation was now hanging by a thread. They saw the A-10 suddenly vomit a shower of what looked like falling stars, a desperate, beautiful cascade of white fire against the darkening sky. The plane itself seemed to break its own back, wrenching itself into a turn so violent they could hear the airframe groaning even from the ground. The duel was on a 200-pound missile, traveling at twice the speed of sound versus the skill and desperate maneuvering of a lone pilot. The white smoke trail of the Igla seemed impossibly fast, closing the distance to the A-10 in seconds. For a heart-stopping moment, the missile appeared to ignore the flares, continuing its deadly trajectory toward the plane's engines. The dance of death was no longer a metaphor. It was a stark, terrifying reality, and the pilot who had saved them was now its lead partner. Inside the cockpit, Katarina Rostova was engaged in a brutal war with physics. The G-forces from her brake turn were immense, a crushing weight that felt like an invisible giant trying to force her down through the floor of her aircraft. Her G-suit inflated, squeezing her legs and abdomen, a desperate attempt to keep blood in her head. Her vision narrowed to a small tunnel, the periphery graying out as she fought against a blackout. Through it all, her eyes were glued to her canopy mirror, watching for the thin white smoke trail of the incoming missile. The string of flares she had deployed blossomed behind her, a chain of brilliant magnesium suns, burning at thousands of degrees. For the missile's simple infrared seeker, this was a moment of profound confusion. Its electronic brain, programmed to seek the hottest object in its field of view, was presented with an impossible choice: the steady, massive heat signature of the A-10's twin engines, or the sudden, impossibly bright and far more alluring temptation of the flares. The smoke trail wavered. For a fraction of a second, the missile's nose cone jinked to the side, seduced by the decoy. It was the critical moment that saved Katarina's life. The maneuver wasn't enough to completely fool the missile, but combined with Kat's violent turn, it was enough to deny the Igla a direct hit on its intended engine target. But the missile had a proximity fuse. As it screamed past just 30 feet below the Warthog's right wing, its sensors detected the massive metal object within its lethal radius and detonated. The world erupted. There was no sharp crack, but a deep, resonant whump that was felt more than heard, a concussive force that struck the A-10 like a giant's hammer. The aircraft was thrown violently upwards and to the left. Kat's head slammed against the side of the canopy, and for a disorienting second, the sky and the ground swapped places. The shrieking of the missile warning system was instantly replaced by the deeper, more terrifying wail of the master caution alarm, accompanied by a cacophony of other alerts. Her instrument panel moments before a sea of calm green lit up like a Christmas tree in hell. Red and amber lights flashed everywhere. Eng fire, staktantain, huid press fail, nor gen fail. The stick went sluggish in her hand, turning from a precise instrument into a heavy, unresponsive club. The plane was trying to roll onto its back, a death spiral. "No, you don't!" Kat snarled through gritted teeth, fighting pure instinct. She threw all her strength into the controls, planting her left foot hard on the rudder pedal, physically forcing the wounded beast to level its wings. Smoke began to fill the cockpit, thick and acrid. Through the haze, she saw the fire warning handle for the right engine was glowing. Following her emergency checklist, now ingrained as muscle memory, she reached up and pulled it. With a muffled thump, the engine's fire extinguishers discharged. She then hit the fuel cutoff, starving the fire. The roar of the right engine died, replaced by the grating sound of windmilling damaged turbine blades. She was now flying a single-engine 15-ton jet with crippled hydraulics. But she was flying. From the ground, the men of Trident 7 watched the scene in abject horror. They saw the flash of the explosion, a brilliant orange and black flower that bloomed right beside the A-10. "She's hit! She's hit!" Rico yelled, his voice cracking. The plane faltered, seeming to hang in the air for an impossible moment. A thick plume of black smoke began to trail from its right side. It dipped its wing and started to slide towards the earth. This was it. Their miracle was over. Their angel was falling. But the A-10 was a special kind of angel. It was forged in foundries, not heaven, designed by engineers who understood that battlefields were brutal, unforgiving places. The plane was built around a titanium bathtub that protected the pilot and redundant control systems that could withstand incredible punishment. It was a machine that refused to die. To the SEALs' utter disbelief, the plane did not spiral. It shuddered, it bled smoke, but it fought. They watched breathless as it slowly, painfully corrected its roll, the descent arrested. The wounded Warthog, trailing a banner of its own mechanical blood, clawed its way back to a stable, level flight path. It was scarred, crippled, and flying on one engine, but it was still in the sky. It was still in the fight. A collective sigh of relief, one they didn't even realize they had been holding, escaped from the men. Their awe for the machine was surpassed only by their awe for the anonymous pilot who was taming it. In the cockpit, Kat finally had the aircraft under control. She was flying on manual reversion, wrestling with the controls, her muscles already beginning to burn from the effort. The symphony of alarms had quieted, leaving only the steady red glow of the damage indicators. She was alive. Her plane was wounded, but alive. She took one shaky breath, then another. Her gaze shifted from the warning panel back down to the valley floor. The technical was still there. Other pockets of insurgents were beginning to regroup. The job wasn't done. The air in the Bagram Combat Operations Center was cold, sterile, and smelled of electricity and stale coffee. Here, war was not a visceral reality of blood and dust, but an abstract collection of data points on enormous glowing screens. It was a place of order, of control, of absolute adherence to protocol. And Colonel Alistair Finch was its presiding deity. He stood before the main tactical display, a map of eastern Turkestan that sprawled 20 feet wide. His arms were crossed, his posture rigid. 10 minutes ago, the friendly blue icon for Valkyrie 2-1 had vanished from the screen. Captain Rostova had transmitted one final clipped message about avionics trouble and atmospheric interference before her signal was lost. It was a plausible story. Plausible enough that Finch had initially felt a pang of professional concern. Get me a comms link through the satellite, he had ordered his staff. Patch her through. I want to know her status. But the minutes ticked by, and there was only silence. It was a young airman first class, a radar technician, with eyes like a hawk who saw it first. Sir, she said, her voice hesitant. I have a primary-only skin paint, bearing 2-7-5, it's faint, but the vector is consistent with Valkyrie's last known position and speed. Finch moved to her station, his boots silent on the raised flooring. He stared at the screen. A single anonymous green dot was crawling across the grid lines. A skin paint. Was the raw radar return a ghost without the friendly electronic handshake of a transponder? The dot was not moving east towards Bagram. It was moving west. Directly towards the red-shaded polygon that bore the label Gorum Valley, High Threat. The truth hit Finch with the force of a physical blow. The avionics trouble was a lie. The comms failure was a lie. He had given a direct lawful order, an order designed to save a pilot's life. And that pilot, Captain Katarina Rostova, had looked him in the eye through the radio, acknowledged his command, and then deliberately spat on his authority and flew straight into the mouth of hell. A cold, white-hot rage ignited in his chest. It was the fury of a commander whose perfect, orderly world had been shattered by a single act of insubordination. He thought of the sheer arrogance, the gall it took for a captain to decide she knew better than the entire command structure, better than the intelligence reports, better than him. His hands clenched into fists at his sides. The first thing he would do when, if she returned, would be to personally strip her of her wings and sign her court-martial papers. But beneath the glacial layer of his anger, a deeper, more volatile emotion churned fear. It was the sickening, gut-wrenching worry of a man responsible for the lives under his command. He had given the order not just to protect an asset, but to protect a person, a young woman with a distinguished record, who he knew had ghosts in her past. He knew about the Helmand incident, and he knew with a sudden terrible clarity that she was not flying into the Gorum Valley to be a hero. She was flying there to exorcise a demon, and in doing so was about to make herself a martyr. Get me a Reaper drone over that valley. Finch commanded, his voice a low growl. I don't care what you have to divert. Do it now. And scan all emergency frequencies. I want to hear a pin drop in that sector. He was a man in command of billions of dollars of military hardware, of thousands of personnel. Yet in this moment, he was utterly powerless. He could only stand and watch as a single green dot crept deeper into enemy territory. He couldn't talk to her. He couldn't warn her. He couldn't help her. The minutes stretched into an eternity. The green dot began to circle within the valley. She's on station, the radar tech whispered. Her speed is dropping. She's in an attack pattern. Finch closed his eyes. He could picture it perfectly, the A-10 diving, the flash of its cannon, the insane risk she was taking. Then just as he opened his eyes, the technician spoke again, her voice tight with alarm. "Man, I've lost the signal. The dot is gone." The screen was empty. The command center, which had been humming with controlled activity, fell utterly silent. Every eye was on Finch. In that silent, terrifying void, Finch felt the full weight of his command. He had lost her. He would have to write the letter. He would have to face the inquiry. But then, after 10 agonizing seconds that felt like 10 years, the technician gasped. "I have it again. It's back. But..." Sir, her speed is significantly reduced, and her track is erratic. Finch leaned closer, his knuckles white as he gripped the back of the chair. She was hit. The enemy had engaged her, and they had hit her. She was wounded, crippled, flying a single-engine aircraft that was barely airworthy, and she was still there. She wasn't running. She was still in the Gorum Valley. The rage returned, now mingled with a grudging, infuriating sense of awe. She was a fool. She was a disobedient, reckless, and insubordinate pilot. And she was magnificent. He turned to his operations chief, his face a mask of stone. Keep that drone feed live on my screen. I want to see everything. Inform the search and rescue squadron to be on hot standby. The second that plane goes down, I want our people in the air. He stood his lonely vigil, a king watching a disloyal knight ride into a battle he could not win, torn between the fury of her betrayal and a desperate silent prayer for her survival. Flying the wounded A-10 was like trying to wrestle an enraged bull. With the primary hydraulic systems gone, Katarina was on manual reversion, a control method that meant she was physically moving the flight surfaces with cables and brute force. Every adjustment, every slight bank or climb, required a massive effort that sent fire screaming through the muscles in her arms and shoulders. Sweat beaded on her forehead and dripped into her eyes, stinging them. Her instrument panel was a disaster zone of red and amber lights. The most critical of these was the fuel gauge. The needle was deep in the red. She was running on fumes. She had done what she could. The initial insurgent assault was broken, their ranks shattered. But she knew from experience that this was a temporary state. The remaining fighters were now regrouping, taking cover in the most defensible structure in the village, a half-destroyed mosque, whose thick, ancient walls provided excellent protection. From there, they could pin the SEALs down indefinitely. Kat's weapon status was just as critical as her fuel. She had one AGM-65 Maverick missile left on its pylon, and maybe 2 seconds of fire left in the GAU-8's depleted ammunition drum. She had only 1 bullet left in her gun, metaphorically speaking. She had to make it count. She could not stay. She could not leave. She had one option left: to trust the men on the ground. Her gloved thumb switched her radio from receive only to transmit on the emergency guard frequency. She took a breath, pushed the exhaustion from her voice, and spoke her words, a calm, clear island in a sea of static. To Trident 7, this is Valkyrie 2.1. How do you copy, Haltanzitz? Down in the ruins, the voice that came through the speaker of Thorne's radio was so clear and unexpected that for a moment he thought he was hallucinating. It was calm. It was controlled. And it was female. Any surprise at that fact was instantly vaporized by the overwhelming bone-deep relief of making contact. After hours of suffocating silence, it felt like hearing the voice of God. He fumbled for his own handset, his heart pounding against his ribs. He thumbed the transmit button, hoping the damaged radio had enough power for a short-range broadcast. "See, Valkyrie," he rasped, his voice raw with dust and dehydration. "This is Trident 7. We read you 5 by 5. You are a damn miracle." "No time for that, Trident." The voice came back professional and direct, betraying none of the life-or-death struggle she was enduring. "Listen to me carefully. I am single-engine and losing hydraulic pressure. I am at bingo fuel. I have to leave this valley now. I can give you one more pass. 1. I have a single Maverick missile and less than 100 rounds for the gun. You tell me where it hurts the most." The grim finality in her tone sobered him instantly. 1 pass. This was their last chance. Thorne risked a look over their cover. He saw the muzzle flashes from the mosque less than 50 meters away. The insurgents had turned it into a fortress. They were trapped. The enemy is consolidated in the mosque. Thorn transmitted Grid 34S WH771931. It's their command post. But Valkyrie, it's less than 50 meters from our position. It's danger close. Too close. There was a pause on the radio, just a second or two, but it stretched into an eternity. Thorn could hear the strain of the single overworked engine in the background of her transmission. He could picture her in the cockpit fighting her damaged jet, weighing his words. A Maverick has a 20-pound shaped charge warhead, the voice of the Valkyrie replied, as if she were discussing a textbook problem. Its blast is focused forward, not out. I can put that missile through a window from 2 miles away. The question, Trident, is, do you trust me to do it? The question hung in the air, heavier than any bomb. She was asking him to bet his life and the lives of his men on her skill, on the promise of a stranger in the sky. He looked at Reyes, who was pale and barely conscious. He looked at the grim, determined faces of Axe and Rico. He looked toward the minaret, where Ghost was still providing what little cover he could. Their ammo was gone. Their hope had been a flickering candle until this pilot arrived. To refuse this offer was to accept a slow, certain death. He made the only choice he could. He took a deep breath, held the handset to his lips, and sealed their fate. Valkyrie, you are cleared hot. Thorn said, his voice as steady as a rock. I repeat, cleared hot on the mosque at grid 771931. Danger close is confirmed. He paused, the words catching in his throat. For God's sake, Captain, don't miss. A final transmission came back, devoid of any doubt, a sliver of pure, cold confidence that cut through all the fear. You roger that, Trident. Stand by for the fireworks. Naum. Thorn screamed at his men. Take cover, brace for impact. They flattened themselves against the dirt, huddling as low as they could, men of action, now reduced to prayer, waiting for a storm that would either cleanse their world or shatter it completely. Having received the coordinates, Katarina Rostova ceased to be a woman fighting a broken machine. She became the machine. The pain in her arms, the blare of the warning lights, the critical fuel gauge, all of it faded into a distant, irrelevant hum. All that existed was the target, the weapon, and the unshakable pact of trust she had just made with a desperate voice in the dark. She pushed the control stick forward, forcing the wounded A-10 into a final shallow dive. It was not a smooth or elegant maneuver. The aircraft shuddered and complained, the single remaining engine screaming in protest as it tried to manage the stress on the damaged airframe. Flying on manual reversion, Kat felt every vibration, every groan of protesting metal as a physical extension of her own body. Her entire world was now the glowing green symbology projected onto the glass of her heads-up display. On her right-hand screen, the targeting pod's infrared view showed the village in stark monochrome. The mosque glowed with a ghostly white heat, a beacon of concentrated enemy presence. Her thumb flew across the controls, slewing the sensor's crosshairs. She zoomed in, the image sharpening. She could see the dark rectangle of a large window on the second floor, the very window where the heaviest fire had originated. That was her aim point. Not the building, but the window. A target no bigger than a door. Her crosshairs settled. A lock-on tone chirped in her headset. The calm female voice of the avionics system spoke the word that sealed the building's fate. Locked. Get ready, boys, Kat whispered to the men she couldn't see. Her thumb depressed the pickle button on her control stick. There was no violent shudder this time, just a clean, sharp whoosh and a slight lurch as the 300-pound Maverick missile dropped from its pylon. For a split second it fell, and then its solid rocket motor ignited with a brilliant flash, launching the missile forward on a perfect, invisible line of energy connecting it to the target. Her job was not over. She immediately hauled back on the stick with all her strength, her muscles screaming as she pulled the heavy, crippled aircraft out of its dive. She had to clear the blast fragmentation pattern. The A-10 groaned, the wings flexing under the strain, but it responded. It clawed its way back into the sky, away from the death it had just delivered. On the ground, Thorn and his men had their faces buried in the dirt. They heard the strained, high-pitched whine of the A-10's single engine as it dove, a sound that was both a prayer and a death sentence. Then came a new noise, a terrifying high-speed hiss that grew louder by the millisecond. It was the sound of the missile, a fiery serpent screaming towards a point just yards from their heads. The world seemed to hold its breath. In that sliver of time, Thorn thought of his daughter's smile. Axe Novak recited the names of his children under his breath. Rico Diaz squeezed a small metal crucifix he wore around his neck. They were preparing to be saved by an act that was statistically indistinguishable from being killed. There was nothing to do but brace for the impact and trust the voice from the sky. The impact was not the deafening boom they had expected. It began with a sharp, violent crack. The sound of the missile's shaped charge warhead punching through the mosque's thick stone wall. A microsecond later, the main charge detonated inside the confined space. The ground beneath them bucked and heaved as if struck by an earthquake. A wave of pure pressure, a solid invisible fist rolled over their position, sucking the air from their lungs and slamming it back in with brutal force. A shower of dust pebbles and hot fragments rained down upon them. It felt as if the sky itself was falling. Then silence. A profound, ringing silence that was more shocking than the explosion itself. The constant nagging crack of enemy rifle fire was gone. The rhythmic thumping of the heavy machine gun had vanished. The shouting, the chaos, the entire soundtrack of their impending death had been switched off. Slowly, cautiously, Thorn lifted his head. The air was a thick, choking fog of pulverized concrete and smoke. As it began to clear, he saw the mosque. It was no longer a fortress. It was a hollowed-out, burning husk. A gaping, blackened hole marked the window the missile had entered. Tongues of fire licked out from within, casting an eerie, dancing light on the ruins. The primary threat, the one that was seconds from wiping them out, had been surgically and brutally excised from the battlefield. He scrambled to his feet, his ears still ringing. His men followed, rising like ghosts from the dust, their faces masks of disbelief. The battle was over. They were alive. Thorn's gaze swept upward, searching the twilight sky. He found it a dark, familiar shape, trailing a thin line of smoke limping eastward towards the horizon. He watched until it was just a small speck, a final fading scar against the bruised purple sky. He lifted his useless radio to his lips, out of pure, ingrained habit, a silent thank you sent out to the pilot, who had flown through the wall of protocol and the breath of death to give them back their lives. The sky over the ridge was quiet. The flight back to Bagram was 150 miles of controlled agony. The adrenaline that had sustained Katarina through the fight had long since leached away, leaving behind a profound, bone-deep exhaustion and the sharp, throbbing pain in her arms and shoulders. The sun had set completely, and she flew through a cold, star-filled darkness. Her only companions were the rhythmic shudder of the damaged airframe, the steady, overworked roar of her single remaining engine, and the constellation of red and amber warning lights that glowed on her console like malevolent eyes. Every gust of wind, Every pocket of turbulence tried to wrest control from her. The A-10, normally a stable, forgiving aircraft, had become a wild, unpredictable beast. Keeping its wings level was a constant, grueling battle, a physical argument with tons of metal that wanted nothing more than to give in to gravity. The silence over the radio was absolute. She was a ghost, returning from a war no one had sanctioned, her only proof of existence the faint trail of hydraulic fluid she was bleeding into the upper atmosphere. 20 miles out from Bagram, she broke radio silence. Her voice was a hoarse, tired croak, but the words were precise. Bagram Tower, this is Valkyrie 2-1. A startled pause, then the controller's voice, sharp with disbelief. Valkyrie 2-1. We had you off scope. Acknowledge. Acknowledged, Tower. Kat said. I am declaring an in-flight emergency. I am single-engine experiencing severe hydraulic failure and have sustained significant airframe damage. I require a straight-in approach to runway 023. Requesting crash rescue and emergency services be on standby. The professional clipped exchange belied the severity of her situation. On the ground, her words sent a ripple of controlled chaos through the airfield. The crash phone rang in the fire station. Floodlights on the runway snapped on, cutting brilliant white paths into the darkness. An entire base held its breath, waiting for the return of its ghost. She saw the runway lights, a beautiful, orderly string of pearls in the blackness. The landing was going to be the final, most difficult test. With her failing hydraulics, she had to use the emergency gear release, letting the wheels drop and lock using nothing but gravity and airflow. She had no nose wheel steering and limited brakes. This would be less of a landing and more of a controlled arrival. From the ground, they saw her first as a faint, distant shape with an unnatural silhouette, one of her engines dark and silent. She came in fast, faster than usual, trailing a thin plume of smoke. She didn't glide. She fell, a wounded bird being guided to earth by sheer force of will. The tires hit the tarmac with a violent screech of protesting rubber. The plane bounced once hard, slamming back down with a groan of tortured metal. Kat wrestled with the rudder pedals, fighting to keep the plane centered on the runway as it veered and fishtailed. It felt like an eternity, but finally the mangled Warthog shuddered to a halt, surrounded almost immediately by the flashing red and white lights of a dozen emergency vehicles. With trembling hands, Kat went through the shutdown sequence. As the last of the systems powered down, a profound silence fell inside the cockpit. She took a deep, shaky breath, the smell of her own sweat and burnt electronics filling her lungs. When she finally pushed the heavy canopy open, the sudden rush of cool night air and the distant wail of sirens felt like a return to the living world. Slowly, painfully, she unstrapped herself and climbed down the ladder. Every joint, every muscle screamed in protest. As her boots touched the solid tarmac, she saw him. Colonel Alistair Finch stood alone just beyond the ring of fire trucks. His figure a stark silhouette against the powerful floodlights. He wasn't yelling. He wasn't directing the emergency crews. He was just watching her. Kat straightened up her exhaustion, a physical weight on her shoulders, and began to walk toward him. The noise of the crews faded into a background roar. Her world narrowed to the space between her and her commander. She came to a halt 2 feet in front of him, and through sheer discipline, brought herself to a position of attention. She was ready for the storm, for the righteous, career-ending fury she so richly deserved. But the storm never came. Finch was silent for a long time. His eyes, unreadable in the harsh light, flickered from her bruised, exhausted face to the smoking, bullet-riddled wreck of his A-10 and then back again. His expression was not one of simple anger. It was a complex, turbulent mask of fury, profound relief, and something else she couldn't name, something that looked almost like grudging respect. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, devoid of any emotion, which made it all the more chilling. "Go to debrief," he said, the words cutting cleanly through the night air. "Get checked out by the flight surgeon, then go to your quarters." He took a half-step closer, his gaze locking with hers. "And write your report, Captain." He said, the formal title a cold, sharp blade. "Every last detail." Kat held his gaze, understanding everything that was left unsaid. The inquiries, the hearings, the inevitable end of her flying days. She gave a single, slow nod. Then, without another word, she walked past him, a lone figure heading into the light, leaving her commander alone on the tarmac with the scars of her insubordination. 6 months after the Gorham Valley, the world no longer smelled of ozone and cordite. It smelled of sea salt and stale beer. The bar was a quiet, dark wooded place in San Diego, the kind of establishment where sailors and ghosts came to drink in peace. Katarina Rostova, just Kat, now the title of captain. A relic of a former life, sat in a booth in the corner nursing a glass of bourbon. The condensation on the glass traced a wet ring on the worn oak table. The reckoning had been swift and surprisingly quiet. There was no court-martial. Colonel Finch, in a final inscrutable act of command, had buried the incident under a mountain of classified paperwork. His official report was a masterpiece of ambiguity, citing unprecedented battlefield conditions and loss of tactical command and control data. Kat's insubordination was reframed as a pilot exercising extreme discretionary judgment to save a high-value strategic asset. She wasn't punished, not officially. But she was done. The inquiry board concluded that her actions, while successful, demonstrated a psychological profile incompatible with the rigors of the chain of command. It was a gentle, bureaucratic execution. She was honorably discharged, her wings permanently clipped. She had won the battle in the valley, but had lost the quiet, procedural war that followed. She wasn't bitter. She was simply adrift, a warrior without a war, a pilot without a sky. She was swirling the amber liquid in her glass, watching the light play through it when she felt a change in the room. A presence. She looked up and saw him standing near the door, his eyes scanning the dim interior. He was different from the voice in her memory. Taller than she had imagined, with a quiet solidity about him. The dust and desperation of Turkestan had been washed away, replaced by the calm, steady gaze of a man who was comfortable in his own skin. He was not in uniform. He was just a man in a bar. But she knew him instantly, and from the way his eyes locked onto hers with no hesitation or surprise, she knew he recognized her too. Lieutenant Commander Marcus Thorne did not approach her table. He did not smile or offer a greeting. He simply held her gaze for a long moment before turning to the bar. Kat watched his reflection in the mirror behind the rows of bottles. She saw him speak briefly to the bartender. A minute later, he walked over to her booth. In one hand, he held a glass identical to hers. In the other, a second glass. Both were filled with a deep, peat-colored liquid that she recognized as a very fine single malt scotch. He did not speak. He did not say, "Captain Rostova." He did not say, "Thank you." Words were insufficient tools for the thing that lay between them. They would have been an insult, a trivialization of the moment in the valley where their lives had become irrevocably intertwined. He simply and deliberately placed one of the glasses of scotch on the table in front of her, directly beside her half-finished bourbon. He then took the seat opposite her, his movements economical and sure. Kat looked down at the offering. It was a language she understood perfectly. It was a libation, a sacrament. She looked up at him, at the small, faint scar above his right eye, at the quiet gravity in his expression. She gave a single, almost imperceptible nod of acknowledgement. The silence that followed was not awkward. It was a living thing filled with the unspoken weight of their shared history. In that silence, he acknowledged the career she had sacrificed. In that silence, she acknowledged the lives of the men he had brought home. In that silence, they both acknowledged the ghosts of the fallen and the profound, invisible bond that tied them, the pilot in the sky and the soldier on the ground, together for eternity. They sat like that for a long time, two veterans on a quiet Tuesday night, sharing a space that no one else in the world could enter. Finally, as if on an unheard signal, they both reached for their glasses of scotch. Marcus Thorne raised his glass a fraction of an inch from the table. Katarina Rostova mirrored the gesture. Their eyes met one last time over the rims. It was not a toast to victory, but to survival. Not a celebration, but a solemn remembrance. It was everything that needed to be said. Then, in the quiet, smoky air of a San Diego bar, they drank. This story, at its heart, is an exploration of the silent contracts that bind warriors, the unspoken debts, and the profound trust forged in moments of absolute crisis. It seeks to move beyond the spectacle of combat, to find the quieter, more resonant truths in the spaces between the gunfire. True heroism, it suggests, is often found not in the roar of a cannon, but in the solitude of a cockpit, in the crushing weight of a choice that pits a career against a conscience. It is about the courage to defy a system not for glory, but because it is the right thing to do and to accept the quiet personal cost that follows. The value of a narrative like this lies in its commitment to honoring the complexity of the human spirit under pressure. We journeyed with Katarina Rostova not just to witness her skill as a pilot, but to feel the weight of her past, the burden of her decision, and the quiet dignity of her sacrifice. We sat with Marcus Thorne not just in his desperation, but in his moment of profound, wordless gratitude. These stories matter because they remind us that behind every uniform is an individual grappling with fear, doubt, and an unwavering sense of duty to the person fighting alongside them, whether they are on the ground or a phantom voice from the sky. If these explorations of courage, consequence, and the unspoken bonds of honor resonate with you, I invite you to subscribe. By joining this channel, you become part of a community dedicated to telling the stories of the quiet professionals and the profound human moments that define them. Thank you for bearing witness to her flight.